Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? What could be more alien to the universal aspirations of our peoples than war?
I like this song.
Of course you do.
Hello, Derek.
Hello.
Welcome to your relaxation time. Let this wonderful 80s classic soothe you. Just a nice, warm, happy time. Happy, happy, happy. Ha 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 ha. Nothing to worry about at all.
Up at one point in my discussions privately with General Secretary Gorbachev, when you stop to think that we're all God's children, wherever we may live in the world, I couldn't help but say to him, just think how easy his task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together.
Kind of almost coming out co-altitude as this thing's coming out. I'm going to meet it, and it just, as it crosses our nose, it accelerates, and literally in less than, probably less than a half second, it just goes and it's gone.
And you saw no visible propulsion, no wings or anything to make it fly in our atmosphere.
As these two pilots are heading back to their aircraft carrier, they get a radio call from one of their radar techs.
And he's like, "Hey, sir, you're not going to believe this, but that thing is at your cap." It showed back up. It just popped up. This is like 60 miles away. It just reappears.
Within seconds, 60 miles away. Just like that. By the time they get back to the Nimitz, the object is gone. So they gear up and get ready to send another jet out to investigate. And this time, they make sure that an infrared camera is strapped to the bottom. With the camera recording, they found the tic-tac again. Okay, so now we're looking at real data, real evidence that we can analyze. Get us away from relying on someone else's memory. What you're seeing is an object that is somehow flying through the sky. These infrared cameras will usually show a heat signature of exhaust or some kind of energy that shows how an aircraft is being propelled. Something. But here there's nothing. And yet suddenly this object, in the blink of an eye, blasts away. And to be clear, we just showed you the raw clip. We didn't edit this in any way. This was back in 2004, but no.
Okay, so what do you make of the recent UAP stories and attention and response and subsequent response?
I'd like to ask you first.
So I had a look at the first whistleblower from about 2 months ago quite closely with Andy Stumpf, who used to have pretty high-level security clearance, and he explained to me about how unimpressive that particular type of security clearance is, how very common.
Which one? This is David
Yes, David. No, not David Fravor. Who was
No. David Fravor was the Tic Tac.
Correct.
This is Dave Garush.
Yes.
Okay.
Very common level of security clearance. That using that as some sort of this is a legitimate credential. Doesn't really wash too much. That it was it was third-hand information mostly, second-hand information kind of. I heard from a person who saw or who heard.
Right.
It just seemed to me to be rather, on the face of it, unimpressive, that release.
I see.
What did you think?
Well, like I've been telling everybody, these are highly conserved stories. This is not the only person I've heard this story from. I've heard this from multiple people. There are various versions of this secret world which play out as space opera. You know, then MJ-12 became the real government that only even the president couldn't understand, you know, and it's like, okay. So that's the weird part about it until you start realizing how sober many of the people are who believe this and who claim to have had direct contact with it. And then you don't know what to do. I mean, in other words, whatever this is, there is a thing. It's not necessarily little green men. It could be, for example, that they mock up a floating spaceship in a hangar and then they drag people past it and say, whatever you do, do not look to your left or right or you'll be shot. And then, of course, people look and then, like, mission accomplished. Now people will say, oh, my God, you have no idea what the U.S. has incredible technology. And then maybe the idea is you've got a cover story. Maybe you've got your adversary investing in things that don't make any sense. I don't know. But there's nothing here. This is not about Mylar balloons and seagulls anymore.
I'm trying to come up with a word for it, but it's like recursive false flags.
Yeah.
In a way, where the goal is not to give or hide truth.
The goal
is to fire hose with information so much that the truth can no longer be discerned.
It's a haystack of bullshit to make sure that any needle is very difficult to find. It is.
Yes. Bullshit haystacking. I love it. Yeah.
Okay. So they haystack the crap out of this thing. I have no question that there was something that was used to develop U.S. aircraft like the B-2 bomber and the SR-71 Blackbird. So if you see something crazy in the sky, better that you think it's a UFO from outer space than some advanced thing from Lockheed. I have no question that we use this to deal with things like the Chinese balloon shoot down, where we shot down several things in a week and we couldn't recover debris from any of them. I mean, come on, guys. You know, maybe the idea is that this is a head fake to our adversaries to develop the wrong things and to use their treasure on things that won't work. Maybe there's a secret program where some of this stuff is actually real and true, and we're not allowed to know it because it would be too mind-blowing. Maybe there's a cult inside of our government that has replaced angels with saucer-shaped aircraft. Whatever this thing is, it's being used for many different purposes. There's something here. We just don't know what. You know, this is the problem. The princess can't feel a pea because that would be impossible. The princess feels a disturbance. And you can't say what the disturbance is. Maybe it's a golf ball. Maybe it's a cantaloupe. Maybe it's a banana. But whatever it is, there's something wrong with the mattress.
I get occasionally called by somebody from inside. And what I think they're doing, first of all, one, we may be faking a UFO situation for reasons that I don't understand.
If we are faking a UFO situation, do you think that there's technology that's available to people in the United States that is beyond our current understanding of what's possible?
90% no.
90% no.
Because
Wow.
it's very hard. It's very hard to imagine physicists continuing to work on nothing for their entire careers. The number of people who are going to be retiring shortly, having never actually done physics as a physicist. We're talking about wasted lives. People are going to be very weird when they realize that they blew their entire career. And I believe I can say what many of these problems are. And if you want to humiliate me at a leading university, just ask me to talk. You can put it on video. You don't realize how many things the Standard Model has subtly wrong when we explain it to people. It's not that the Lagrangian is wrong, not that the rules are wrong, but we say wrong stuff. We say, like, there are 3 generations that are only of matter that are only distinguished by mass. In other words, there's 3 copies of this stuff here. This is like the wood version, and then there's the plastic version, and then there's the metal version. There aren't 3. There are 2 generations plus an extra imposter generation, which looks like a generation. I mean, I can get into these things. And that should be a provocation. Somebody says, let's call this guy up, have him out, and figure out what he's talking about. Doesn't matter. I don't think we're doing physics.
What do you think they're doing?
I think we are playing paintball rather than going to war, and we're giving prizes for generals who command the best paintball army. And then we're referencing everyone else who's actually trying to figure out how to fight.
Geology isn't a real science!
Well, have you submitted to the paintball competition? It's like, no, I don't want to do paintball. I understand that it keeps your skills up. I understand that some of them are transferable. But I mean, like, you've been in street fights?
Not since I was a teenager.
Yeah, well, I understand. Like, I haven't been for a long time. It's different than what you guys do in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There's lots of stuff you're not allowed to do.
Yeah.
Right. You get in a street fight, it's a completely different thing.
Sure.
What we're doing is not physics in the same sense.
So what they're doing is
we're doing safe stuff.
exercising.
Yeah, exactly.
They're exercising.
And the exercises are keeping people limber. They're keeping people in a fighting mentality. It's not that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has nothing to do with fighting. We've seen people use it in the street for sure, right? But small joint manipulation is part of street fighting. Eye gouging is part of street fighting. Pulling a knife is part of street fighting. These things are not part of any reputable gym that you might go to. So I want to do the thing that isn't paintball. And I didn't want to do it up until recently because the danger of unleashing a neutron on the world is so high. Now I realize I'm done with that. You guys are willing to play footsies with Putin? You're not going to survive. You're not
unless we can somehow channel the technology of interdimensional space beings.
Please never say those words.
Hey, look, the
Interdimensional space beings.
interdimensional space beings. David Koresh didn't say extraterrestrial, he said interdimensional.
Yes, but Eric and David talk, and this is not fair to David Grush. David Grush knows that he's a physics BA. He knows he's not a PhD. He's repeating things that have been said to him. He had the presence of mind to try to give an example of what interdimensional might mean, and he used holography. And so as a result, everyone's making, David Grush says holographic interdimensional beings. This is absurd, and it's not fair to David Grush. I'm telling you, I mean, we can call David up right now, and I promise. Well, I didn't know. Yeah, I'm not convinced that UFOs, like shiny metal craft, are real at all. What I didn't know is that there almost certainly are large programs inside the federal government that are denied, that are labeled UFO, don't tell anyone. Now, whether those programs contain anything about non-human intelligence or aliens or spacecraft or anything like that is anyone's guess, because I haven't seen anything. However, the programs almost certainly exist.
What gives you that impression?
Talking to 4 million people who tell stunningly similar stories. In other words, there is a weirdness. And the weirdness is tremendous circumstantial evidence that these programs have existed for a long time and have involved extraordinary, in particular, physicists way back in the day. And on the other hand, that there's no credible proof that there are craft or aliens or anything like that.
How do you square that circle? How would you?
Can't. Look,
the coordination problem of all of these people is immense.
There's that, but secrets have been kept much more effectively than people imagine.
Say more.
I don't want to. No, but I mean that. There are organizations that you cannot Google. There are organizations that have clubhouses and members that you cannot Google. So I know that secrets are durable. What we don't know is what these secrets are about. See, let's create a decision tree, which is there are little green men, shiny spacecrafts, and all this kind of cool stuff, and there aren't. Okay? If there aren't, what's the best explanation for why there's so much energy and activity and so many claims around this? And I would guess, and again, this is a guess and not a particularly good one, that there was a clearinghouse program for everything under the sun. If we needed to retrieve somebody else's plane behind enemy lines, we had a UFO cover story. If we were trying out new aerospace equipment, we had a UFO cover story. If we were trying to get our rivals to misspend their precious treasure on weaponry and strategic countermeasures, we had a UFO cover story. If we were up to no good, we had a UFO cover story. Whatever all these things are, imagine there was a kitchen sink approach, and that's what UFOs are all about. It's about a black SAP, special access program, as waved and bigoted as it could possibly be, that basically was a one-size-fits-all story for all sorts of things.
It's an extraterrestrial scapegoat.
Yeah, an extraterrestrial scapegoat program. Okay? Now, whatever that is, if you imagine that leg of the decision tree is real, it's all very funny, because now you're like, all these people have taken it seriously, but it was the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians who were supposed to take it seriously. Like, ixnay on the UFO fay, it's like people are going to blow this beautiful cover story that we've created for everything. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that we're on the other leg of the decision tree and that we have no programming for it, and so everything about it seems impossible. What's what you said about physics? Physics is science fiction. The physics that you just learned is almost always about science fiction. What if you have multiple time dimensions and people can circle around in time, and if you find out about them, they can circle back to the point where you didn't know it? You have a neuralizer built into the successor to spacetime. Is that real? I don't know. All I know is that physics will always blow your mind. It will always do something that seems impossible, and that's why it's the coolest subject around. Now, I don't know what's going on, but I can tell you that the circumstantial evidence that there's been a program that has been long-running and involved very high-level people, it's almost impossible to imagine that this is fake. There's a 1971 Australian document from the Australian Intelligence Service that has been declassified and made public, which clears up all sorts of mysteries about what was going on with physics in the 1950s and 60s. And it names names. It says that Freeman Dyson, John Archibald Wheeler, Pascal Jordan the Nazi, all of these people were working on anti-gravity. And the only reason to be working on anti-gravity is that there was reason to think that something had gone beyond Einsteinian relativity. In other words, mostly we learn about physics from colliding. It's like breaking rocks together. You're going to smash two rocks, and then maybe you'll see a little spark, and you'll study that. Except we do it with protons. This would be like some different thing where there was a more advanced species and you're looking at its machinery to try to figure out, well, what science does it know that you don't?
How much truth do you think is in that? I've seen rumors on the internet of leaps forward in technology throughout the mid-1900s that people suggested was due to reverse engineering of something that had been discovered. Do you think that the technology movements that we made through the 1900s were self-created?
I'm not clever enough to solve the UFO puzzle. There's almost no topic where I can't generate multiple explanations. This is the only topic I've ever met where I can't generate a single explanation for what the hell's going on. Nothing I can think up makes sense. Look, I'm very focused on this because if there are aliens here, I might be the only guy who knows how they're here.
How so?
I don't think it's practical to traverse the cosmos using general relativity in the Standard Model. You can use time dilation, you can hope for wormholes, you can imagine generation ships. There's a whole bunch of stupid stuff that people talk about when they talk about interdimensional travel and all this kind of nonsense. Why? Because they can see the night sky and they can't get there. So you think, okay, in terms of the science that I've seen Carl Sagan discussing or on Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson, how would I get to a distant planet using the science I know? And then you have to sort of do it with masking tape and, chicken wire, whatever. Whatever that is, doesn't really appeal to me. They're not here if they're here using standard physics. Now, I've tried to make a list of everyone on Earth who has a distinct theory of physics. Right? So you have, Julian Barbour has a theory, or Stephen Wolfram has a theory, or Peter Woit has a theory. So I go through all of these other theories, and to the best of my knowledge, nobody else does that. Like, we've stopped talking to each other, we've stopped thinking about this. So in the world of theories about how something might be here, there are very few theories of the universe. And why is that? It's because the constraints are so profound. There's no room to move, to imagine, to let human creativity take over. We're in a straitjacket that is so tight nobody can think. And we're there because our theories are so good. The Standard Model and general relativity are astounding theories, but they're also a straitjacket. So I'm very interested in, if you're Obama, you just reach out, grab it and kill it.
Whip.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm very interested in this topic specifically because the universe is either traversable or it isn't.
What spooky things may in fact be true? I mean, I don't know if you've been on the receiving end of recent rumors about our conversation about UFOs very likely changing in the near term, right? But there was just a Washington Post article and a New Yorker article, and I've received some private outreach, and perhaps you have. I know other people in our orbit have people who are claiming that the government has known much more about UFOs than they have let on until now, and this conversation is about to become more prominent.
Yes.
And it's not going to be whatever, whoever's left standing when the music stops. It's not going to be a comfortable position to be in as a super rigorous scientific skeptic who's been saying there's no there for the last 75 years, right? The short version is it sounds like the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Pentagon are very likely to say to Congress at some point in the not too distant future that we have evidence that there is technology flying around here that seems like it can't possibly be of human origin, right? Now, I don't know what I'm going to do with that kind of disclosure, right? Maybe it's going to be nothing, no follow-on conversation to really have. But that is such a powerfully strange circumstance to be in, right? I mean, it's just, what are we going to do with that? If in fact that's what happens, right? If in fact the considered opinion, despite the embarrassment it causes them, of the U.S. government, of all of our intelligence, all of the relevant intelligence services, is that this isn't a hoax. There's too much data to suggest that it's a hoax. We've got too much radar imagery. There's too much satellite data, whatever data they actually have. There's too much of it. All we can say now is something's going on, and there's no way it's the Chinese or the Russians or anyone else's technology. That should arrest our attention, collectively to a degree that nothing in our lifetime has. And now one worries that we're so jaded and confused and distracted that it'll get much less coverage than Obama's tan suit did, a bunch of years ago. It's who knows how we'll respond to that, but it's just to say that
if you tell the people the truth about this, you will lose all credibility because the truth is much less believable than the fiction we're selling. By October 1954, we had mastered what's called gravity control, which most engineers at MIT and elsewhere do not think we can do today. But that was in a deeply classified project. Now, how do I know that? Because one of the people on my team, Richard Foch, who is the top scientist at the largest Department of Defense lab, the Naval Research Labs, but was on my team for many, many years. He was in the vault and saw the papers that proved, and it stated, October 1954 is when we mastered gravity control. Ironically, that in 1955, Eisenhower started the U.S. interstate highway system, and by that date, we didn't need highways.
There is probably no more influential thinker in the study of UFOs than the French astronomer and computer scientist, Jacques Vallée. Beginning in the late 1960s, Vallée drew ufologists' attention to the symbolic or metallurgical qualities of UFO reports, and argued that there was a continuity of experience from anomalous sightings and entity encounters in historical folklore and mythology. For pioneering the first alternatives to the extraterrestrial explanation for UFOs, Vallée has earned a reputation as the grandfather of the new ufology, and he's forced ufologists and anomalists of all persuasions to revisit old assumptions about UFOs and what it is they're doing here. Vallée had an early exposure to the UFO phenomenon. In 1955, during a wave of sightings in France that started the previous year, a 16-year-old Vallée and his mother saw a disc with a half dome on top, hovering half a kilometer away from his home in Pontoise. Vallée's mother said that the UFO eventually just flew away, leaving a few puffs of white substance behind, but Vallée had no memory of seeing it leave. A few years later in 1958, while doing his undergraduate in mathematics, Vallée sent a letter to the prominent French ufologist, Aimé Michel, beginning a lifelong correspondence and partnership. Vallée then completed the equivalent of a Master of Science in Astrophysics in 1961. While working on staff at the Artificial Satellite Service of the Paris Observatory later that year, Vallée learned that his team had tracked the movement of a bright, unknown object orbiting the Earth in retrograde. However, when the team's superior came in to see the evidence, he immediately had the telex tape destroyed. Naturally, this experience convinced Vallée that astronomers and other scientists were not always so honest about the data they collected on UFOs. Soon after, in 1962, Vallée moved to Evanston, Illinois to begin a PhD in computer science at Northwestern University. There he met Dr. Joseph Allen Hynek, scientific consultant to Project Blue Book, the UFO investigation group of the US Air Force. Together with an informal network of scientists and social scientists, Hynek and Vallée shared their UFO research and discussed possible explanations for the data. This group, which included American hypnotherapist Leo Sprinkle and French astrophysicist Claude Poher, called themselves the Invisible College after a network of natural philosophers in the 17th century. Vallée published 2 books on UFOs in this period, Anatomy of a Phenomenon in 1965, and A Challenge to Science in 1966, both of which advocated the popular extraterrestrial hypothesis for UFOs, or the ETH. These books brought a level of scientific rigor to ufology at a time when it was dominated by the sensationalized pulp style of Donald Keyhoe and Frank Edwards, and they earned the still young Vallée a reputation as a leading authority on the UFO phenomenon. In the fall of 1966, both Vallée and Hynek were invited to consult on the recently established scientific study of unidentified flying objects at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Both had wanted to join the study's team, but were barred for their public advocacy of UFO research. They were thus powerless to stop project leaders Edward Condon and Robert Lowe from narrowing the study in such a way as to completely disregard the bulk of Blue Book's cases. The final report, commonly referred to as the Condon Report, was published in 1968 and discouraged further research into UFOs, concluding that such research would be of no benefit to science or national defense. After the report met with near unanimous praise from leading scientists and media figures, Vallée returned to France in disgust and temporarily retreated from the scientific community. After years of speaking with UFO witnesses, and many discussions with the Invisible College of UFO scientists, Vallée began to feel that the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or the idea that UFOs were operated by extraterrestrial beings, was too simplistic to account for the great variety of UFO reports and the incredible experiences of witnesses. In particular, Vallée was puzzled by the fact that many UFO sightings coincided with other paranormal phenomena, such as apparitional experiences and poltergeist activity. He was also puzzled by the fact that many cases involved highly implausible scenarios, with specific elements that could hardly be expected of intelligent interstellar travelers with superior technologies. For example, in an interview in 1975, Vallée remarked upon the large number of cases in which witnesses encountered UFOs in the middle of the road, apparently under repair by their alien crew, or with the crew nearby, engaged in something else. He pointed out that it made no sense for intelligent beings to land in the middle of a roadway when they could have easily landed out of sight, and wondered instead if these scenes were contrived only to present their witnesses with certain images. Inspired by Carl Jung's seminal 1958 essay on UFOs as modern-day myth, Vallée wondered if UFO and entity encounters might be representations of things beyond their physical forms, and might communicate things on an abstract, symbolic level, rather than on a strictly literal one. He searched the historical record for stories of aerial wonders and supernatural beings, and found a number of common themes with modern UFO reports. In his next book, 1969's Passport to Magonia, Vallée presented a selection of historical sightings of aerial wonders and entity encounters, and compared them to modern UFO reports, proposing that the UFO phenomenon began hundreds, if not thousands of years before Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting in 1947. Magonia was one of the first UFO books to feature the reference in a treatise by the French bishop Agobard to flying ships from a sky realm called Magonia, from which Vallée got his title. It was also among the first to tell of the mystery airship sightings of 1896 and 7, and the medieval story of a flying ship dropping anchor over the British Isles, as told by Gervase of Tilbury. Ancient, medieval, and modern sightings differed only in the technologies described by the witnesses, although many sightings of lights in the sky are nearly identical across all eras. Vallée noted the similarities between medieval European stories of fairies, lutins, and kobolds, for example, and the short alien beings seen by abductees and other 20th century UFO witnesses. He also explored tales of similar entity encounters in European myth and Judeo-Christian demonology. All of these entities were known to occasionally abduct their witnesses and leave them with symptoms of paralysis, fatigue, disorientation, and amnesia. Those who accepted these beings' invitations were frequently taken to other worlds, or else reported missing periods of time that they could not consciously account for. To explain these otherworldly visitors, Vallée proposed the existence of a technologically mediated extra-dimensional intelligence that has operated throughout human history, masquerading as creatures of myth and legend in the witnesses' cultures. This intelligence, he suggested, has repeatedly manifested itself in the form of a technologically or spiritually advanced civilization, out of the reach of human technologies, and just outside the understanding of the witnesses. It has evolved its appearance to keep up with our changing worldview and ever-advancing technologies, but always represents what's just ahead of us in our vision of the future, or what's just above us in our conception of the hierarchy of beings. For example, this intelligence appeared over medieval Europe in flying sailing ships, while the continent's brightest minds still wondered if there was another layer of thinner air above our own that was home to another civilization. In 1896, the same intelligence appeared over the western United States in flying machines with flapping wings, while inventors all across the country were trying to solve the problem of heavier-than-air flight. The intelligence then appeared in rounded metallic saucers in the late 1940s, when the world's superpowers began experimenting with jet engines and disc-shaped craft, and just before humanity's exploration of outer space renewed interest in the possibility of extraterrestrial life. To many ufologists today, Passport to Magonia is considered a breakthrough in our understanding of UFOs, but initially at least, Vallée's views made him an outcast in the UFO community, which had largely formed a consensus on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. In his own words, Vallée became a heretic amongst heretics. Still, he continued to build upon the same hypothesis for the rest of his career. Along with the like-minded anomalist John Keel, Vallée created the first major rift in the UFO community, between those who believed that the visitors were aliens and those who sought out alternative explanations. Vallée's next books came in 1975. The Invisible College, also published as UFOs, The Psychic Solution, and a lengthy interview he did with Hynek that was published as The Edge of Reality. Vallée proposed that the UFO phenomenon acted as a kind of control system to alter human belief systems and social structures over long periods of time. By drawing from powerful archetypes in our evolving cultural repertoire, they create a myth about themselves, their origin, means of travel, and purpose for visiting, which in turn influences our mythology with each new encounter. The specific content and logic of these encounters are self-contradicting and frequently absurd, but what Vallée called the metalogic, or their deeper symbolic meaning or purpose, was consistent in challenging people's understanding of reality and permanently altering their psyches. For example, Vallée explored the apparitions at Fatima in 1917 as a potential case of UFO contact, and drew attention to the many comments from witnesses of the so-called miracle of the sun, who claimed that the event changed their perception of the world forever. In 1979's Messengers of Deception, Vallée argued that the UFO phenomenon had physical, psychological, and social dimensions to it, and he expounded at length on the latter too. He suggested that there was a machinery of mass manipulation behind the UFO phenomenon that was attempting to create a new form of belief based around expectation of contact with alien beings. Without being able to identify what they were exactly, Vallée suggested that their purpose may be to achieve social changes on this planet. Their methods are those of deception, systematic manipulation of witnesses and contactees, covert use of various sects and cults, control of the channels through which the alleged space messages can make an impact on the public. Vallée thus argued that in order to fully understand the UFO phenomenon, one had to understand the network of religious groups, contact cults, and government intelligence agencies that intersected it. He also observed that the UFO phenomenon perpetrates its own cover-up by cloaking itself in absurdity so as to be rejected by mainstream culture. As he put it, the phenomenon negates itself. Vallée also questioned whether a scientific investigation was sufficient to understand the UFO phenomenon. Science, he argued, had only ever studied the natural and spontaneous world of earth, water, plants, and animals. Never had scientists attempted to understand something that intentionally deceived its investigators and led them into false beliefs. He suggested that ufologists might need to think more like detectives than forensic scientists and attempt to understand the intelligence behind the perpetrators' machinations. Between 1988 and 1991, Vallée published 3 books, Dimensions, Confrontations, and Revelations, that are together known as the Alien Contact Trilogy for their focus on entity encounters. In Dimensions, Vallée provides one of the most comprehensive summations of his theories on UFOs and ufonauts. In Confrontations, he documented several examples of UFOs causing physical harm and death. For example, he introduced the world to a wave of UFO encounters around Panorama, Brazil in the early 1980s, in which flying box-like objects that the locals called chupas chased people through the wilderness and shot fiery beams that left physical injuries. At least 5 deer hunters died after encounters with the chupas, including one man who went insane with fear after being shot by one. In Revelations, Vallée exposed a number of popular UFO hoaxes, including the famous Roswell case, and criticized the public's fixation on mythologies about Area 51 and alleged US government secrets. In Dimensions, and in a 1990 article for the Journal of Scientific Exploration, Vallée presented 5 arguments for rejecting the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which was still dominant at the time. First, he argued that there were far more landings and contacts than would be necessary for an interplanetary survey or surveillance operation. By his and others' estimates, there must have been 3 million UFO landings around the world in the last 20 years, an impossibly large number. Second, UFOs and ufonauts rarely flew away or walked off when they left. Often, they simply vanished, blinked out of existence, or slowly faded away. This suggests that the craft and occupants were more like projections than physical things. Third, the bodies, actions, and abilities of the ufonauts do not suggest an extraterrestrial or evolutionary origin. Often, the aliens were identical to humans, spoke our language, and were perfectly capable of breathing our air and walking in our gravity. Fourth, Vallée noted that most of the ufonauts' revelations, especially those concerning their origins, were nonsense, and almost entirely different from one another. Ufonauts claimed to be from just about everywhere in the universe, and frequently gave directions or offered maps that made no logical sense, such as the 2-dimensional star map shown to Betty Hill. Finally, Vallée argued that the data collected from cases of so-called alien abduction were unreliable, and again involved highly unlikely scenarios. For example, abductees frequently describe highly invasive and painful medical procedures in order to achieve tasks that even doctors in the 1980s could have done with minimal discomfort. Vallée traveled to the Soviet Union in January 1990 with Martine Castello of the French newspaper Le Figaro to study manifestations of the UFO phenomenon there. He published UFO Chronicles of the Soviet Union in 1992 to share some of the cases that he'd investigated and to report on what he'd learned from scientists, government officials, and intelligence officers in Moscow. In 1991, Vallée made his contribution to the crop circle debate in New Age magazine, arguing that some of the circles, at least, were made by military aerial devices that fired focused microwave beams at the ground. In the spring of 2010, Vallée also published a series of articles on boingboing.net building on this hypothesis. Since the early 90s, Vallée's output on the topic of UFOs and anomalous phenomena diminished considerably, though he remains active in the field.
Look, see those birds? At some point, a program was written to govern them. A program was written to watch over the trees and the wind, sunrise and sunset. There are programs running all over the place. The ones doing their job, doing what they were meant to do, are invisible. You'd never even know they were here. But the other ones, well, you hear about them all the time.
I've never heard of them.
Of course you have. Every time you've heard someone say they saw a ghost or an angel. Every story you've ever heard about vampires, werewolves, or aliens is the system assimilating some program that's doing something they're not supposed to be doing.
Programs hacking programs. Why?
There are reasons, but usually a program chooses exile when it faces deletion.
You are here, in the middle of a domino effect. One that started years ago, and one that shows no sign of stopping. A bombshell story said UFOs are real. A whistleblower said the government knows. The military has encountered them. Every day, for years, there are videos and photos. Insiders say off-world vehicles. Congress says we need to know more about the UFO. A task force created to figure it out. Are they aliens? Is there doubt? A report's released saying maybe it's real. The information comes with an official seal. A UFO office without delusions will look to the skies and find conclusions. The government seems ready for the long haul, and on the dominoes fall.
I will tell you unequivocally that there is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This all seems like it's heading towards an ultimate truth no longer ignored. A revelation, for better or worse, will further define the universe. But the story was too good to be true. The story was wrong. And instead of being closer to the truth, we probably couldn't be further away. For those of you unfamiliar with the current UFO story and the cast of characters within, here's a quick primer based on information that was originally reported. In 2007, at the behest of Senator Harry Reid, the Pentagon, via the Defense Intelligence Agency, created a UFO program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. The first director of ATIP was a person whose name wasn't reported and who remained unknown. The next director of ATIP was Luis Elizondo, a counterintelligence official at the Pentagon, who by now has become the face of the whole story. ATIP was funded with $22 million. The Pentagon awarded the $22 million to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BASS. BASS was contracted to perform ATIP's UFO research and investigation. BASS was founded by millionaire and longtime Harry Reid financial supporter Robert Bigelow. Bigelow's been hunting UFOs his whole life. Within the BASS team was Hal Puthoff, a former member of the Church of Scientology who claims to be a psychic who can predict the future. During the Cold War, Puthoff was involved in the CIA's Project Stargate, which attempted to create psychic spies that could use paranormal powers to fight the Russians. Stargate was shut down after not achieving this goal. The rest of the BASS team was largely unknown. ATIP investigated UFOs for 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. In 2012, the Pentagon pulled the program's funding and shut it down, saying it was determined that there were other, higher priority issues that merited funding. Despite losing funding, Luis Elizondo claimed he kept ATIP going for years after this, staying on as the program's director. On October 4th, 2017, Elizondo resigned from his job at the Pentagon, frustrated that UFOs were not taken seriously by military leaders at the Department of Defense. Immediately after his resignation, Elizondo, Hal Puthoff, and others took the ATIP UFO story to former Blink-182 rock star Tom DeLonge and his To the Stars Academy, or TTSA, a for-profit science and entertainment company. On October 11th, TTSA held a press event featuring Tom DeLonge, Lou Elizondo, Hal Puthoff, and other former government officials who claimed to have new revelations about UFOs. DeLonge introduced Elizondo to the world for the first time.
My name is Lou Elizondo. For nearly the last decade, I ran a sensitive aerospace threat identification program focusing on unidentified aerial technologies. It was in this position I learned that the phenomenon is indeed real.
In addition to revealing Elizondo and the Pentagon UFO program, DeLonge also announced that he was going to
build an exotic craft with an energy source that can revolutionize the world.
Build his own UFO. Another presentation by former DoD official Chris Mellon revealed a shocking new UFO case, and he displayed a large photo of the UFO.
At one point, the object soars to 80,000 feet, hovers, then drops at supersonic speeds, coming to a full stop. How did it accomplish these feats?
The UFO in the photo was later reported to just be a blurry party balloon. The mainstream media reaction to this event was couched as cheeky celebrity news, rather than science or national defense. But that was all about to change. On the same day he resigned, members of TTSA had introduced Elizondo to UFO author and longtime UFO researcher Leslie Kean. She interviewed him and published 2 stories in the Huffington Post in mid-October, which revealed in a media exclusive the existence of the Pentagon UFO program and Elizondo's role in it. However, these 2 stories were still mostly ignored by the mainstream media. Leslie Kean then reached out to longtime associate and journalist Ralph Blumenthal. Blumenthal pitched the ATIP and Elizondo story to the New York Times. And on December 16, 2017, the New York Times and Politico released front-page bombshell news stories that revealed the Pentagon's ATIP UFO program to the world. Included in the stories were videos of UFOs filmed by the U.S. Navy. Within hours, dozens of other news agencies had the story. Within days, hundreds. The first domino had finally fallen.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
Full speed ahead. Ain't gonna stop till we're all the way there. Full speed ahead.
But some people had doubts. They noticed that something was off, that some things were not adding up. One of those people was researcher John Greenwald, one of the nation's leading authorities on government secrets. He runs the Black Vault, a website that hosts millions of pages of government documents obtained via the Freedom of Information Act. When he read the December 2017 UFO stories, he immediately noticed some strange discrepancies.
Well, right off the bat, I noticed that the reporting from Brian Bender at Politico and Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper at New York Times had a slightly different program name. Politico says Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program. New York Times reports Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Why was there that difference? The amount of sources that both news media outlets had were very, very small and likely the same. So how is it that the reporting was different? As the reporting went on, it got worse. I mean, there were like 7 or 8. I lined them all up with dates and who the media outlet was. And there were like 7 different variations of what ATIP even stood for. And to an investigator or a researcher like myself, and there's a lot of other people out there, if you're looking into something, you need to have the name right. Because if you don't have the name right, how are you going to find anything?
Right. Because when you submit a Freedom of Information Act request, you have to be specific with the government what you're asking for. So if you requested for the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, they could come back and say, hey, that doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
Because the name was wrong.
Yep.
And you could suddenly be on a goose chase looking for the truth, for the real documents, correct?
Absolutely. The accuracy there was incredibly important.
The Pentagon officially acknowledging its Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program.
Pentagon has confirmed the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program.
The Advanced Aviation Aerospace
Aviation, the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program.
So the writing was on the wall that there was something odd just behind the meaning of the acronym.
Another reported detail that is inconsistent was the years all this supposedly occurred. The original New York Times report said the program began in 2007. But further down the same article, they report the funding and actual contract creation of the program wasn't until late 2008.
You start digging in on that and realize that the bid solicitation was never posted for companies to bid on getting the contract, wasn't posted until 2008. Yet we were led to believe that ATIP started in 2007.
No, that video had not been cleared for public. Another confusing detail is, at the very top of the original Times report is a video of a UFO filmed by the US Navy. The Times reports that ATIP investigated and released this now famous video to the public. Yet the video was shot in 2015. ATIP shut down in 2012. Also, the Department of Defense released a statement saying no, that video had not been cleared for public release. And some in the media wondered how much of this was simply a so-called sweetheart deal between Senator Reid and his longtime friend and financial supporter, Robert Bigelow. Back in 2017, there were a handful of journalists who pointed this out as a potential red flag. The original story were in error. And guess what? Then, in October of 2021, the plot twist. Remember that unknown and unnamed individual who was the first director of the ATIP UFO program? Well, we eventually learned his name, James Lakatsky. And after that, we learned his story. He's finally come out of the shadows to set the record straight. Lakatsky, along with Colm Kelleher, a project manager for the Pentagon program, and journalist George Knapp, released a book titled Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, an insider's account of the secret government UFO program. They say the story we've been told for over 4 years is wrong. Lakatsky's book says, since the December 2017 article in the New York Times, there has been a multi-year frenzy of speculation, misinformation, and confusion about the nature of the program. One of the purposes of this book is to correct the record. Co-author Colm Kelleher did an interview saying,
the New York Times article in December 2017 mistakenly used that acronym ATIP, and they mistakenly assigned Lou Elizondo to be head of this program. And that was a mistake in reporting by the New York Times.
They say many details in the original story were in error. And guess what? There's actually real documented evidence to back that up. And surprisingly, some of these documents have been out in the public domain for years now. It's just that many people, including myself, didn't fully understand what they were or how they related, if at all, to a Pentagon UFO program called ATIP. Probably because they don't mention anything about ATIP and they don't mention UFOs. They mention something else. So I now present to you the mostly untold and underreported story of the Pentagon's OSAP program. In 2008, at the behest of Senator Harry Reid, the Pentagon, through the Defense Intelligence Agency, created a program not called ATIP, but rather the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or OSAP. We know this because here's the actual official Pentagon document outlining OSAP, not ATIP. The director of OSAP was a Defense Intelligence Agency scientist named James Lakatsky. We know this because here is his name listed on official Pentagon documents as being in charge of the program. In many ways, OSAP started with James Lakatsky. According to both Lakatsky and Senator Reid, Lakatsky had approached the senator to say he believed the UFO phenomena was real, and he wanted a program to investigate not just UFOs, but also how UFOs might fit into the realm of what we might consider the paranormal. Reid told Lakatsky he would support the creation of a program, but, according to Reid, they faced a challenge: how to convince Congress to allocate taxpayer money to investigate UFOs. Could they create a UFO program without actually mentioning UFOs? Reid told New York Magazine, "I said to Lakatsky, well, if you were me, what would you say to people in power in the United States Senate who have huge control over the spending of defense money?" And here's what Lakatsky said: "What I will do is prepare something for you that anyone can look at that wants to. And it's strictly science." He put it in scientific language, what the study should consist of. Here are the actual OSAP contract objectives. There are no mentions of UFOs at all. To anyone reading it, it might seem like just a normal aerospace technology contract. The actual objective of the program was essentially, using currently evolving technology trends, predict what kind of aerospace technologies foreign adversaries will have 40 years from now. That's basically it. OSAP appeared to be something normal, that the government would normally spend money on. OSAP was funded with $22 million. The Pentagon awarded the $22 million to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BASS. BASS was contracted to perform all of OSAP's technical research and analysis. We know this because here is an actual Pentagon document acknowledging BASS as the contract recipient. BASS was founded by millionaire and longtime Harry Reid financial supporter Robert Bigelow. Within the BASS team was Hal Puthoff, who we already briefly discussed, as well as other scientists with a history of unorthodox ideas, including Dr. Colm Kelleher and
You ever consider going there yourself?
was. Prime example of the government wasting taxpayer money. But because all of that wasn't mentioned, and only unidentified flying objects were, that New York Times article continues, and she replied that her specific goal with that article was to give UFOs credibility, so she avoided reporting on some things.
I chose not to focus on it because the angle that I was taking in my reporting was to try to get credibility for the subject, and I knew that that was not the way to go. That was not the first step in terms of getting people to accept this.
So an author of the original New York Times article, the article that was the first domino to fall in all of this, says she wrote the article with a specific angle in mind: get people to accept UFOs as real. That sounds like the goal of an activist, not a journalist. But I see where she's coming from, because could you imagine if that first New York Times article had talked about werewolves and poltergeists and giant dino beavers? It would have been laughed at and ridiculed and used as a prime example of the government wasting taxpayer money. But because all of that wasn't mentioned, and only unidentified flying objects were, that New York Times article continues to validate UFOs with not just your average citizen, but also with members of Congress.
Since the New York Times story came out in December 2017, it's politically viable for elected officials to come forward and say, I support this kind of research. But that's for researching things in the sky that might be a threat to national security or to aviation safety. It's another matter for a politician to say, I agree with spending money to investigate places like Skinwalker Ranch with spooky stories of boogeymen and werewolves. No politician is going to fund poltergeist research or looking into werewolves. They'd be crucified.
So how much of the actual story did the original New York Times article report? How much of the actual story is currently influencing Congress?
The scope of the OSAP program was gigantic compared to the small sliver of information that was reported via the New York Times. And so the purpose of the book was really to set the record straight. I think the book really encapsulates about 97% of OSAP, whereas the 3% was what the New York Times article had described.
3%. According to those actually in charge of the actual program, the original New York Times article about the program.
Director of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program.
Luis Elizondo ran the Advanced Aviation.
The first time many within the Pentagon had even heard about this program. And Reed's letter used the nickname ATIP. So according to those who were previously in the dark about all this, ATIP was the name of the program. 2. The Pentagon didn't want this embarrassing story spreading outside the Pentagon. They didn't want it in the press, and they didn't want speeches in Congress about government waste. So they moved to shut it all down. The New Yorker quotes a Pentagon official saying, "People worried that if all this came out, that the government was spending money on this will be a bad story." The Pentagon pulled OSAP's funding in 2010, and by 2012, the funding had completely dried up and OSAP was officially dead. But despite the program being shut down, Lou Elizondo, who had become interested in the UFO aspects of OSAP, claims he kept the effort going at the Pentagon. According to James Lakatsky, Elizondo adopted and appropriated the name ATIP to describe this new, small, unfunded, and unofficial effort. Lakatsky has only done a handful of interviews since going public. Here's a revelatory clip from one of them on the Coast to Coast radio show where he specifically addresses this.
The ATIP name was created for a letter that Senator Reed sent in trying to establish a DOD SAP for our program for various reasons. And Lou used that name when and I guess it had to be in the time frame of 2012, and he used the name ATIP. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's fine. But there was a difference between the two programs. Ours had $22 million in funding, his had zero. But he did his thing, we did ours. But I can say that we were the only game in town.
So what did Lou Elizondo actually do? You know, the guy who everyone refers to as the director of ATIP, the Pentagon UFO program?
Luis Elizondo, former director of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program.
Luis Elizondo ran the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program.
The man who ran that secret program, Luis Elizondo, thank you for joining us.
Was he even involved in the official Pentagon program at all? In the 221-page book about the Pentagon UFO program, Elizondo appears one time. That's a bit strange, right? One time. At a 2009 dinner, sitting at a table with members of OSAP and BASS, where the authors claim he was telling war stories about his psychic powers. That's it. Well, Elizondo himself has stated multiple times on the record that he had nothing to do with OSAP, including this emphatic tweet, which says, "It's been brought to my attention that despite my constant assertion in the media about my non-involvement in OSAP, some are under the false impression that I was part of it. For the record, again and again, I was not part of OSAP." Elizondo instead says he was in charge of the Pentagon's ATIP program, which I think we've established probably didn't even exist. Insiders say it was not an official program.
Can't talk about it, unfortunately. This is my frustration, Joe, because I know what I've seen. I know my colleagues have seen, right? And to this day, there's video that's coming in on a regular and routine basis that is very, very compelling. And if the
How do they hide this stuff from the general public?
Well, we have classified systems. We hide a lot
Right,
of
but
things.
how is it getting filmed? Is any of it getting filmed by the general public, or is all this military stuff?
So let me backtrack a little bit. There's a general public that is filming stuff, but from a Department of Defense perspective, our focus, now Aero is a different story, but when I was in the government, we had to be very, very careful of something we called intelligence oversight. Back in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, particularly in the Department of Defense, was kind of naughty. They were doing things they shouldn't do. They were spying on students, and they were spying on American citizens.
You
and
don't
they were doing
say.
things. Yeah,
Crazy.
Right. Say it isn't so. So Congress passed some laws and said, okay, you can no longer do this kind of stuff on American citizens, right? You can't conduct intelligence operations on American citizens. You can't do it. It's illegal, right? Okay. So you have Executive Order 12333 and all these other rules and laws and DOD 5240.1 that all come out and say no mas. So Department of Defense is supposed to focus on military. That's it. You don't bring in U.S. persons' information and ingest them into a Department of Defense database, especially a Department of Defense intelligence database. That's a super no-no. That's called U.S. persons' information, and it's pretty much verboten. So our focus was looking specifically at military-sourced information. I was not focusing at all on what the private citizens were seeing, because at the end of the day, we couldn't use it. You can't do anything with the data.
And it seems like you got plenty of compelling footage from the military.
Overwhelming. There's absolutely no doubt that we didn't have to look at civilian data because we had better collection sensor systems from the military that was looking at stuff and giving us better insight.
If you can't tell us about, can you give us some sort of an understanding of like what you're talking about?
Yeah, sure.
Without being specific?
Yeah, let me see. Okay, yeah. There is a video, high-resolution video, of I can't say what platform it was taken from. I can't say where it was taken from.
Okay.
But an object that, do you know how large an offshore oil derrick is? They're huge, right?
Yeah.
They're almost like a small city, right? They're like one city block. They're huge. They're enormous things. There is a video that shows one of these objects underwater that goes by. The speed was calculated between 450 and 550 knots underwater, and it was bigger than the offshore derrick that it was passing, because you could see in the video the offshore derrick, and you could see this thing zip right by it.
Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of them, right? A lot of them are reported as being transmedium.
Right. So that exactly. Why do we use the term UAP, right? Now it's unidentified anomalous phenomenon, because it's all domain. Initially it was UFO, unidentified flying object. And for several reasons they changed the name. One of them, not just because of stigma like people think, but because the word flying object means flight. And
Right.
you have to have wings to fly. That's flight. And these things don't have wings. So that term, we're not even sure is even accurate anymore, because they're not necessarily flying. Possible. Kind of think of like a unifying theory.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you had the ability, energetic source at a certain frequency, and it interacts with certain material, certain metamaterial, and I got to be careful exactly what I say, but certain
There is no indication of aliens or
They cannot be interesting aliens if the best they've got are some floaty.
Let's start with finishing up some business from before the last block. It is actually you as a human.
Yes.
I cannot reach past.
You just use that as an excuse to squeeze my bicep.
For anyone who thought that the hologram joke was serious. But we do have the actual White House of the United States engaging with this question. When you hear people say, because they're shooting things out of the sky, could they possibly be alien life, you say?
I would say if it remains unidentified, there's a chance it could be. However, just think it through. If aliens crossed the galaxy in whatever is their spaceship and arrived at Earth just to throw some balloons across North America, I'm thinking, really? Really? And even if the aliens did do that, are those the aliens you want to meet? They cannot be interesting aliens. The best they've got are some floaties, cylindrical and octagonal floaties that any F-22 fighter jet can just knock out of the sky.
All right, so we're going to do this. We're going to do the alien thing on the news, okay?
I love aliens.
Okay.
Nobody doesn't love the aliens.
That answer is very persuasive, and there is no public evidence here leading towards extraterrestrial life.
Correct.
But the counterpoint to that answer would be that a very sophisticated foreign entity, not of this world or
truck. It was like parallel to the ground, just a cylinder right on the top of this thing. And for years I thought, okay, you know, like there's got to be oxygen supply or like a vacuum sealing thing that you would, you know, because obviously I'm thinking it's drugs. I was like, okay, so this is a very advanced way to do that, just years of thinking of this. And come to find out, when I gave my speech in D.C. on that Saturday for the Disclosure Project with Dr. Greer, he's got a lot of people coming out of the woodwork, by the way. And this gentleman, I'm not going to give any detail. I know a little bit about him, but he works in some of these projects that are some very controversial facilities. He's aware of what was going on. After I gave my presentation of this, he confirmed, he says, no, he's like, I don't want to leave Michael hanging out there, but I was not expecting to come and talk to you about this. And he went explaining what the operations do, why they do it, and what they were using them for. And he says, there's not drugs that they're putting in these shipping containers. He says it's humans.
Human trafficking.
Yes. His own words. And, he, you know, of course. And he also wants to come forward, at least with him and 30 other people that are involved with that part of the work. But it was very disheartening to actually get that information relayed to me, because here I'm thinking for years it's drugs and it's a much sinister thing. But it makes sense because they use natural disasters that people are going to be missing anyway.
Yeah.
Scoop up people.
I mean, I've been covering human trafficking this year.
Right.
And that's, you know, a lot of the human trafficking comes from third world countries in distress. You're in a third world area.
Yep.
In distress. Right after an earthquake would be, I mean, it's prime.
Yeah.
Prime time to do a human trafficking operation.
Right.
How big were the containers?
I would say probably 8 feet and 10 feet. 8 feet tall, 10 feet within.
So like maybe half a Connex box?
Yeah, about that.
Okay.
And they were kind of like on the trailer that was underneath was kind of like a regular Humvee trailer that you would see kind of pull stuff, something like that.
How were they being lifted into the craft?
So they were driving onto this platform that was angled, so it would hit, and it just raise up, and they were just driving on this ramp.
Oh, the
but
truck
the whole
would go
thing,
up?
yeah, but the whole thing was a ramp.
Okay.
Like a circular ramp. And I mean, obviously I can't see what's on the other side of it, but I'm assuming because it's a circular pattern that it's going to be the same on the other side. Because they would drive onto this platform, and at that point I saw all the doors open, 4 guys would come out, and then I'd going back to what we're facing here with these guys searching our stuff, asking us questions, taking our IDs, trying to intimidate the crap out of us. And so I can see the guys come out of the truck. And that was making me think too, like at a tactical advantage, we didn't have that. There's only 6 of us.
Albert K. Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau. This was during the big UFO flap of 1952 when flying saucers were witnessed over Washington, D.C. and many other areas around the world. And this organization blew up big within that first year. However, just a year later, he suddenly ended the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and people wondered why. And what happened was that he came home one night, went into his bedroom, and suddenly these 3 dark, shadowy figures materialized through his wall into his bedroom. They were wearing the hats and the overcoats. They had glowing eyes, and they smelled like sulfur.
According to Bender, the 3 entities communicated with him through telepathy, warning him to discontinue his UFO research and stop publishing his influential magazine, The Space Review. Afterwards, he became ill and didn't eat for 3 days.
All right, take it easy, guys. Take it easy. Take it easy. Oh, it's okay, Dave.
Yes, sir. I understand. I'll take care of it.
What a goddamn mess. Donaldson?
Yes.
What do you want to do?
We have to reset him. Call for a briefcase.
You kidding? It's gonna take a signed order from the chairman.
We'll get legal on it.
Legal just arrived. There's no way the chairman approves a reset. This is your fault. There's no way you get a briefcase.
Hey.
What are my options?
Hey. Just bullshit him.
Bullshit this guy?
Hey. What's going on here?
Look at this. Questions will burn in him till the day he dies. He won't stop searching for answers. He won't quit. We'll have to watch him forever. Make sure he doesn't talk. Endless ripple effects.
Remember the Torres case 40 years ago?
It's not that bad, is it?
In the end, they just leveled with him.
Completely?
Looking at that, I don't see you have a choice.
Who the hell are you guys?
We are the people who make sure things happen according to plan. My name's Richardson. You really think I couldn't see that coming? I can read your mind. Yeah, really.
For the most part, the men are really buff. They have really strong
Very buff
bodies.
men.
They might be a little bit taller than we are, and if you see them the way they naturally would look, their skin is pretty darn pale. It's a little bit too pale, like it looks a little bit too white. And they have white hair, which is another strange thing. If you see them in their native form, their eyes will either be a dark blue or a violet color, which we do not have. And then another interesting thing is that their pupil is kind of like a diamond shape. It's not reptilian, it's not this
It could just be from Star Trek, from the older Star Trek, some fantasy lore.
teeth. And they have fewer teeth in their mouth than we do. I believe they only have 22 teeth. They kind of have this little scalloped edge on the bottom of the teeth, and also they have a scalloped roof of their mouth. Like our soft palate in the top of our mouth is flat. Theirs is like a cat. It has ridges, really thick, deep ridges. And we currently have been treaties where the Centaurians are allowed to walk around in our everyday world.
Oh, now it gets good.
Talked about this is Paul Hellyer, the former Canadian Minister of Defense, in which he's talking about these people being authorized to walk around in Nevada.
And do we see where does this person say this?
But then the house will have an elevator shaft that will actually go deep down.
Yeah, we saw all these buildings, they don't have elevator shafts, and we can prove that because from the photos you can see that they don't even have a basement. You can clearly see not one of these buildings has a basement. They don't have basements. Like most buildings in the USA, they don't even build like a fundament basement. This is very common. I don't know why they do it. It's just cheaper. But no basements. No Arcturian bases here. I can't see any of them here. I can't see any basements even. They're just built on the ground. They don't even build a fundament. Right? You can see it's flat as it gets. There's no basement. A swimming pool, that's the only hole in the ground that they actually have built here.
And then
No
go
tunnels.
down to one of these sub-shuttles where they can shuttle over to their underground city.
Yeah, right.
So the house is not necessarily where they live all the time.
Sure.
But then the question is, can they get...
But can you see how it would like induce some kind of pseudo-schizophrenia if you think that, if you expect that some people here living are Arcturian aliens, and you see a person who looks tall and blonde and a little bit buff, then, as he said, then you might suspect that they are some alien starseed. This is schizophrenia. This is complete schizophrenia. If you, whether you believe that they are the good guys or the bad guys, in both cases it's schizophrenia if you
to
believe this.
their elevator fast enough to get down below where the fire is. How many of them actually died? How many of them burned up? I don't know. You know, the Alliance is in the middle of what they call active operations right now. The final stage of getting ready to defeat the Cabal, so the briefings have dried up. But...
active operations is the term for a psychological operation, right? It's a psychological operation. He tells you this is a psychological operation, PSYOPs.
I would imagine a lot of Centaurians died in this fire. And they
Sorry, it's Centaurians, it's not Arcturians. I must be very racist.
they couldn't act fast enough because literally, as I said, people were trying to evacuate and the fire was so fast they didn't even have time to make it to their car.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that
just
is
for the
crazy.
record,
But look at him.
people on-
Look at that dumb expression he makes. Like, is this person buying this? Is he so baffled that... Making a very concerned Wilcock face.
our show that subscribe are gonna totally buy that elevator story.
He's mocking...
Arsenic.
He's mocking the Wilcock class, but he's mocking the audience who watches this. They are actively mocking you.
This interview is neither for the queasy nor the faint of mind.
There are more videos, some are better. How much better? As good as you could probably want.
Per many of your comments, I haven't cut much from this interview. I left it pretty raw, long form, and unedited. It's a deep technical dive into the physics of UFOs, along with the implications of their prominence in the modern zeitgeist. That is that we are either being subjected to the most interesting, effective, and weird government PSYOP of all time, or our top scientists are missing something fundamental about the nature of reality. And finally, Hal gets about as candid as he's ever been about the government psychic spy program Stargate, while Eric, who's a little more skeptical of parapsychology, tries not to throw up.
We ran 70-30 instead of 50-50.
Sorry.
But if you want to do it, feel free to do it. I've told you how to do it, so you can just go do it.
Okay. You don't have a lot of room to move. You either have to postulate new physics, or you have to say this isn't material. Everything here is bold.
My conclusion is that there is something there.
I don't like losing to Jesse. It's horrible losing to him on UFOs. I don't want to lose to him a second time. But something is wildly off.
So with that out of the way, hit subscribe and get ready to unlearn everything you thought you knew about the material world with Eric Weinstein and Hal Puthoff.
Different parts of the brain have different activities.
But you know that, don't you?
Maybe you should interview me.
The Intelligence Committee has ordered the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense to deliver a report on the mysterious sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, more commonly known as UFOs.
The reason I found the report fascinating was because it reeked of conflict. I could clearly detect a voice, an authorial voice that wanted to disclose more, and one that said over my dead body. And the over my dead body people seemed to be stronger but losing ground. The first branch of the decision tree is it stuff that is unintentionally in the air versus stuff that is intentionally in the air? The unintentional stuff was broken into two categories, and that was clutter and atmospheric effects. The stuff that is intentionally in the air was broken into the next branch, which was us, not us. Not us was broken into two things: known others and unknown others. And that other is intentionally in the air, not us, not anyone we know. Not necessarily aliens. Could be coming out of the ocean, could be time travel. I mean, who the hell knows? But anything in that other category is astonishing.
I think one very important thing that most people in government who study this seem to sort of have a consensus on, that the public might not realize, is the idea that there is a separation between substrate and signature when it comes to UFOs. And there might be a difference in terms of the way somebody perceives it and some underlying sort of proto-architecture.
Yeah.
And so if we have been seeing these things for thousands of years, we've been seeing them in different forms.
Different forms and maybe different sources.
Mm-hmm.
These days, since our technology platforms are so high to generate effects they could mimic, and our detection platforms are so well advanced so we could see a lot more, then it really is a zoo of options and possibilities. And so, for example, for the Tic Tac videos that are so well known, Lou Elizondo was behind releasing those videos. I remember seeing them in the Pentagon before they were released. But there are more videos. Some are better.
How much better?
Well, as good as you could probably want.
If you showed me pieces of a craft and you guaranteed me somehow that it came from outside the solar system, my first thought wouldn't be technology. It would be physics. Because everything is so far away from us, other than our solar system, that I would be wondering, well, how did it get here? When you look at the Civil War in the United States, it took place in the 1860s. Within less than 100 years, we were dropping fusion devices from jet aircraft. Less than 100 years, less than a single lifetime, means that we almost had a nuclear civil war, and it was a very near miss. Now, what separated the 1860s, which looked like antiquity to many of us, from 1952, when we have the first fusion weapon explode? It was changes in our understanding of the physical world. That means any time you have a profound physical insight post, 1940s, you have to ask yourself, what Pandora's box would a new physical insight potentially open? And I don't know why we're not more worried about this. I think because we've been failing at physics for 50 years, we've gotten out of the habit of thinking physics is really dangerous and you have to track every single important physicist. Because any change in our physical understanding of the universe can unlock holy hell.
Were there actually updates in physics, maybe mid-century, that were not disclosed to the public?
Another puzzle we would love to have cleared up is an understanding of the role of aerospace companies as holders of potentially basic scientific knowledge not shared with the academic world. Is it possible? It seems very wrong to me.
Maybe wrong, but it's true.
It is true. You believe it's true.
Yeah, I know it's true.
You know that there's physics knowledge held by aerospace companies that is not
There
known?
certainly is materials knowledge.
Materials, well, okay, material
which
science.
involves topological physics or whatever.
Okay. But fundamental physics as opposed to, condensed matter or...
Right. Certainly aerospace corporations have knowledge in the UAP area that specifically are sequestered against FOIA.
Oh,
because of proprietary
I appreciate
labels, which the whole thing was set up to be that way. on purpose.
Right, but the idea that there would be fundamental physics knowledge that would be housed in an aerospace company and not shared with the physics community, there is no evidence of that.
No evidence for it, not that I know of.
And I wouldn't.
That doesn't mean it's not the case, but
that would be this crazy, egregious.
It would change our entire concept of who we are if somebody kept fundamental physics secret in the years since we became capable of exploding fusion devices. Right. I would grab a pitchfork and a tiki torch, and I would march on the National Science Foundation.
Right, right.
I mean, I still can't believe that that's true.
It would only be if it were the case that in fact we have mastered anti-gravity and they're being built by aerospace corporations, then new physics would have to be involved.
Is what is called the golden age of general relativity tied to these topics? That is, there was this bizarre surge of activity in general relativity between, I would say the time of Einstein in the 50s or something like that. There wasn't a ton of development in GR, and then suddenly there was this explosion. There was
there's the explosion. There's a famous series came out in the Miami Herald and other newspapers in probably the 50s. The author was Talbert, and he did a series where he found out that a number of aerospace engineering companies were suddenly interested in anti-gravity, and that people like DeWitt on up and down, really top level physicists, were suddenly getting grants to look at the idea of anti-gravity. For example, the gravity essay came along.
This is from the Gravity Research Foundation in Boston.
Right. And so it looked like it was going to be a big explosion. But anyway, then it all sort of quieted down. And I could take two implications of that, and that is it quieted down because nobody ever got anywhere, or it quieted down because they did get somewhere and it went black.
My understanding is that there were really twin loci of activity, one of which surrounds a Gravity Research Foundation in New Boston, New Hampshire, and I guess that was the work of Babson, and the story is sort of not really very plausible, that his sister had drowned in a pond or something to that effect, and so he had gravity as his sworn enemy. You know this story?
No, I had not heard this.
Oh yeah. So Babson contacted Lewis Whitten, who was coming out of Johns Hopkins, and then oddly, the similarly named individual named Bainson, with some sort of tobacco or air conditioning fortune, reaches out to Bryce DeWitt and asks whether he will found an institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for the study of physical fields.
And particularly focusing on gravity.
Particularly focused on gravity. Now somehow DeWitt has the courage to answer this essay contest in the other silo and destigmatizes it. So there was money to be had, but nobody wanted to touch it because of fear of ridicule from their colleagues. And then there's a famous gravity conference at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that sort of kicks a lot of this off. It's a tremendous flurry of activity at a time when anti-gravity was trying to break into respectability. At a minimum, we know that the Glenn Martin Company, where Martin was an early pioneer, I think from the time of the Wright brothers, that the Glenn Martin Company becomes Martin Marietta, later becomes Lockheed Martin, so that word Martin is coming all the way through, was employing, I believe, Lewis Whitten, Edward Whitten's father, to do anti-gravity research, somehow tied up with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. So there's something about aerospace in the 1950s and sort of post-Manhattan Project era that's pretty potent. And we're confused by this. Why was Solomon Lefschetz, the great topologist, recruited to be involved with Lewis Whitten and to have an entire nonlinear group working on mathematics that then gets moved to Brown University when I believe that these programs are sunsetted, so they get spun off back into the academic ecosystem. I don't know what any of this is.
So you have top physicists working on
But you have
Crazy stuff,
but
anti-gravity.
Most physicists don't know this story.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, I knew it because it was weird. It stood out. The Lewis Witten, Edward Witten story has never been fully made sense. The world's most brilliant physics mind of our time is the son of the country's most prominent and important anti-gravity researcher of the 1950s.
Do you think that string theory, which Ed Witten worked on, is intentionally a bridge to nowhere?
I have privately said to you that string theory was a very odd development because it both allowed physics to proceed as if it was doing something new while breaking no new ground in the physical world in which we live. I don't really know. If you were trying to stagnate the field, string theory is pretty brilliant. If there was knowledge that allowed you to traverse the cosmos, in other words, if you could render Einstein's theory effective, just the way Einstein rendered Newton's theory non-fundamental, but an effective theory derived from Einstein's theory in a limit, to not share that knowledge with the physics community would be seen as gross academic and intellectual malpractice.
Yeah, if somebody had that level of knowledge, I mean, the best that we could do in the ATIP program was say, okay, let's accept Einstein's GR as being the theory.
Okay.
Even though there are all kinds of arguments for why something ought to
By
be
GR you mean general relativity.
General relativity. And for this subject area, for the UAP subject area, as far as we've gone, is to say, okay, suppose I treat general relativity, Einstein's equations for general relativity, the way I would treat Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism. If we could manipulate variables in Einstein's equations the way we manipulate variables in Maxwell's equations, you would see certain kinds of things which tend to match claimed observations of UAP phenomena. Somewhere there's a missing key for how you can do manipulation of those variables in Einstein's equations without having to have a black hole in your pocket.
Are you talking about the idea that you want to promote constants to field content, to be actual physical fields that can vibrate and live and move?
Yes, I would say so.
But then you have the quantum mechanical consequences. When you promote something to field content, you break it, you bought it. You've got a lot of...
you got fluctuations and uncertainty principles.
And it contributes to all sorts of processes, and sometimes you get explosions of terms of series, and things stop converging, and things can get quite bad. Is that something that you feel you've handled?
Well, at a certain level.
How can we describe in layman's terms the idea of promoting a constant, like a gravitational constant, into a field variable? So a very kind of helpful actually analogy used for me, I'm a total idiot when it comes to this stuff, is a circle and pi being a constant. The area of a circle is pi r squared. And so if the circle had bumps in it, or if it was topologically different in some way, pi wouldn't be pi. Pi would sort of be more variable.
In such circumstances, something that you thought was a constant turns out to be variable when considered in a larger space of possibilities. Likewise, if I asked, what is the temperature in this room? I'm feeling a little bit chilly. And you might say, oh, I think the temperature is 64. But then we might find out that, in fact, the room varies between 63 degrees and the 69 degrees in a different corner of the room. So something that you thought was a number, like we had inflation estimates of 6.8 and then 7.0%. And I was very angry about that because my claim was that you should report inflation on various maps the way you show the temperatures in the country on a temperature map with gradients and isotherms and what have you. If you do that to numbers like, for example, the gravitational constant, that constant could be the value of a function. And if it was the value of a function, and then that function became quantum mechanical, you would have to treat it quantum mechanically. It's not cheap to replace a number by a function or a field. We have an entire planet pulling us towards these couches, and yet when the interview is done, we will get up from these couches defeating an entire planet. The weakness of gravity is one of the great mysteries of our lives. It's inconceivably weak.
True enough, yeah.
And if we accept Einstein's general relativity as, again, I'm not quite sure how much of it you take issue with, it would seem that we're either prisoners here, or that we have to lean so heavily on time dilation, or that we would have to amass levels of energy. I mean, your point is,
we can't do it from what we know, for sure.
Okay, so then the idea is we'd have to have something wrong in GR.
Yeah, something is at least missing.
Okay.
And maybe GR is okay as it goes, but we're missing something that would have the effect of manipulating the variables in there that we can't do with any reasonable engineering approach.
Well, so far as I know, there's only one analog that even smells vaguely like this in electromagnetism. Aronoff and Bohm argued that if you passed an electron beam around a solenoid and passed a current through it, if it was perfectly insulated, you would have no E and B fields out, that is electric and magnetic fields, outside of the solenoid, but yet you'd get a phase shift in the electron beam as it circled. This is what's known as a holonomy effect.
You guys talk about this incredible experiment called the Bohm-Aronoff effect. Can you show me the actual experiment?
Imagine you have some sort of an electron gun, and you have a beam of electrons, and they hit a first mirror so that they bounce off of that mirror. You have a next mirror in the form of a diamond, and I'm looking down on my tabletop experiment, and I've got some sort of a detector over here. If I have a wire here that's heavily, heavily insulated, I can imagine running a current through this wire, this solenoid in the center, and the E and B fields would be dead equal to 0 because of the insulator. However, when I pass current through this wire, mysteriously the detector picks up different patterns of self-interference of the phase of the electron function. In other words, this setup can detect whether there's current passing through the wire despite near perfect insulation. That was what was so frightening in the late 50s, is that we were discovering that it wasn't the electromagnetic fields at all that were really the important actor in the electromagnetic story. We thought we understood electromagnetism from the time of Maxwell, but clearly the electromagnetic 4 potential was really the main actor.
Do we understand the nature of the electromagnetic 4 potential? Or is it just this sort of weird empirical?
Geometrically, I think we have a very good handle.
Okay. And so you mentioned the Higgs field looking like something like a, analogous to like a wine bottle. What would the electromagnetic 4 potential geometrically look like?
Well, it looks like a version of the Escher staircase or the Penrose stairs. In effect, those stairs would be something like, we would call them horizontal subspaces. The weird feature of going around a circuit and always going up the stairs and yet never climbing in height. That would be what we would call a holonomy effect due to curvature.
Paradox.
And you can go way beyond that, so there are all kinds of toroidal geometries, for example, where you have no EM fields whatsoever, but you have strong vectored scalar fields. And since you have no Lorentz force in the absence of E and B, then how can you detect them? Well, you detect them by any kind of quantum detector that can detect phase shifts, can detect the vector and scalar potential even in the absence of fields. So there's a whole engineering approach concerning which I have 2 patents, by the way, and have started a new company that involves only dealing with vector and scalar potentials.
When you are trying to come up with this analogy between electromagnetism and general relativity to explain some of these effects. Are you dealing only with the Levi-Civita connection of the metric as Einstein did, or are you considering...
I'm basically dealing with the metric coefficients by postulating a dielectric vacuum whose dielectric constant values for, say, epsilon and mu, the permeability and permittivity of the vacuum, can be manipulated. And once you manipulate those, you're manipulating C, which is 1 over the √ mu epsilon. And so once you begin to manipulate C, then you can change effects associated with all of the, and so you could, with this polarizable vacuum approach, which I published in Physics Journal, you can get all of the quote tests of general relativity and so on. So the fact that you might be able to pursue that further by taking into account the fact that underlying electromagnetism is vacuum fluctuations, which have the effect of controlling the value for epsilon and mu. So then you say, okay, well, if I want to go over to general relativity, maybe I can control the underlying values for the metric coefficients. So there are various mathematical approaches to kind of pushing Einstein's equations to be not quite Einsteinian.
So we're not talking about, this is what has been confusing to me. There's a question of accepting the Einsteinian prison or trying to do to Einstein what Einstein did to Newton and then say there's a more fundamental theory. And what you're really saying is that you're trying to come up with a more fundamental theory than general relativity, in which many of the things that are hard-coded are in fact vacuum expectation values that are only discernible within the theory, something like that.
Yeah.
There are consequences after impact.
You have a theory that is a greater, it's more expansive than Einstein. Einstein would be...
You can locate Einstein within it.
You can locate Einstein within it. And so does any of the stuff in geometric unity, your theory, dovetail with what you're seeing in terms of observables with UFOs and UAPs?
There are two strong versions of geometric unity. In one case, you put an extra 6 dimensions as time dimensions into the mix. And so 1 plus 6 is 7. And then you've got 4 extra spatial dimensions, and 4 plus the 3 spatial dimensions we already know is 7. So you'd have what we would call a split signature metric 7 and 7, 7 times 7 space. And the other way of effectively gluing these extra dimensions is to flip them. So you'd have 4 extra time dimensions. That would be 5 time dimensions in total versus 9 spatial, with 3 that we know plus 6 new ones. In either case, though, you're talking about multiple temporal dimensions. And even physicists rarely talk about multiple temporal dimensions because it completely breaks our paradigm of what we might call Hamiltonian dynamics. The idea that you can take any situation in space and then propagate it through time to get the future. When you have more than one time dimension, you have more than one future. You have no arrow of time. You have a whirlpool of time for the first additional time dimension. Then you have a right-hand rule of time. And so this arrow of time becomes something you call a time orientation. And then the weird, horrible thing about that, if I may use the board.
Yeah, go for it.
When you have more than one temporal dimension, you now have a new possibility that you've never considered, which is you could go back into this extra time dimension and find yourself at an earlier event without ever having to retrace time steps. You wouldn't have to run time backwards. We don't really know how to think about these things very well. They lead to something which is called ultra-hyperbolic equations. And we don't have a ton of focus or skill around these sorts of problems. One of my biggest concerns is that if geometric unity turns out to be true, we don't know what it means to be able to hack extra temporal dimensions And that's a big concern.
I mean, it would probably explain some of this, at least observably faster than speed of light travel.
See, that's the thing. There is no faster than light travel. And we have to train people away from saying, do you think we have faster than light travel? There may be something that would appear to be faster than light.
Temporal dimension hacking. Which sort of makes it, because a lot of these UAPs seem to sort of materialize and dematerialize at will.
Look, there's certainly scope for pattern matching if you have things like dark chemistry, dark light, if you have multiple spatial and temporal dimensions beyond what we know. The concern, though, is we don't know whether they're accessible. The interest and the fear has to do with the idea that maybe somebody else knows the answer to this and they aren't human.
So that one's called The Time Warp?
I can't believe you never saw Rocky Horror Picture Show.
No, I have. I know it's a cult classic. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen it. No.
Yeah. Speaking of cults, Hal, weren't you in Scientology?
Oh, years back, I checked into it because at that time we were doing, setting up a remote viewing program. We were checking into everything, silver mind control, Scientology, whatever. I thought some of the techniques were definitely of value, but I disconnected from them in the mid-70s or whatever.
I think what we need to do is we need to talk about pseudoscience and stigma and its weaponization and its use. So the first thing I want to ask you about is, does our government have a protocol to wield stigma as a tool for keeping its programs secret? Is the government a source?
Certainly there are parts of the government who consider that to be their job.
Is there language for the manipulation of stigma to discourage people from undertaking scientific investigations that might lead them into an area of security concern?
There is a language in there. There are certain operations that sort of have that effect, but there are people who are trying to get around.
You personally have been the target of a great deal of directed stigma, it would seem to me. Do you have a sense that that your career has been directed by manufactured stigma?
Certainly, there was manufactured stigma and control. We've had people actually shut down a piece of a program on the basis that American taxpayer dollars should not be spent on pursuing demonic technology.
You know Dan Sheehan?
Yeah.
Okay. I was friendly with Dan Sheehan and admired his work taking on all of these crazy cases against the government, not knowing he had any interest in UFO UAP. There was an attempt to discredit him through stigma because of his interest in the Iran-Contra matter with the Christic Institute, and so I think he was fed wrong information probably so that he'd swing at a bad pitch. And that's why I was very interested in the weaponization of stigma and whether or not you were party to any knowledge of how that is carried out so as to keep these programs.
No, I've never, other than being the effect of them.
You do want to keep things like the Loch Ness Monster and spoon bending away from the UFO conversation if you can. And there's this tremendous force in this world to say, well, if we're opening our minds to UFOs, my aunt lived in this house that was haunted for 27 years. Like, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to listen to the fact that your aunt's house was haunted. Now, the thing that goes against what I'm saying is something like cattle mutilations. So either somebody is an amazing sadistic animal hoaxer, or you have to open the UAP story to them communicating something by their decision to study cattle or leave cattle as presents for us or who knows what.
Well, that brings up this really weird place called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. I think it's near the Utah Basin. Uinta Basin. And so there's a myth that involves the Ute tribe fighting the Navajos. And I believe the Navajos sick these skinwalkers, these sort of
shape-shifting. The Utes were collaborating with the United States government. The Navajo weren't so happy. And so they cursed this particular spot of land with skinwalkers.
And the family that used to live on the land would see tons of cattle mutilations. They'd experience all sorts of paranormal things. Bigelow buys it. Bigelow's obviously very interested in the UAP phenomena. And now it seems like it's this place where they do all sorts of experiments. They have anomalous electromagnetic effects on the grounds. So what do you make of this?
Something is wildly off. This stuff is interesting enough that it should be attracting scientists. And the scientists who are attracted to this should be debunking the living crap out of this if it's some dime store BS. But the absence of scientists is itself puzzling.
Yeah.
Partially due to stigma, partially due to the fact that nobody wants to get sucked into some low-rent horror movie where two kids see a creature in the Black Lagoon and they try to tell the townspeople and no one believes them.
Yeah. The question is the stigma manufactured, or is the stigma because all this stuff is bullshit?
We're pretty clear that a lot of stigma is manufactured.
Mm-hmm.
So the government talks about, in internal documents, image cheapening.
And what's the context in which image cheapening has been used or discussed?
Famously
in that
against a woman who was a leading actress in Hollywood named Jean Seberg. And the FBI, this is how we learned about image cheapening, planted a story with a woman named Joyce Haber in the Los Angeles Times that the baby that she was carrying was in fact not her French husband's, but was in fact the baby of a Black Panther. They drove her to suicide. They drove her to miscarriage first and then 10 years of suicide attempts. But the key point is our government does not necessarily blink trying to turn your reputation into absolute garbage if you get close to its treasured sources and methods.
Yeah.
And that is not compatible with saying that we have something that we don't understand menacing our military, its airspace, and our nuclear sites.
Very strange. It's hard because it's clear that there's some element of PSYOP here, and then it's hard to sort of separate.
There has to be PSYOP.
There has to be.
Because Project Blue Book
Yes.
and the Pentagon report do not seem to be particularly compatible. In other words, it appears that either we were lying then, that there's nothing to see,
Yeah.
and we're telling the truth now, or we're telling the truth then that there's nothing to see, and we're lying now that UFOs are here.
What I find really interesting about the Blue Book history is Edward J. Ruppelt was sort of running Blue Book. He was an Air Force general. And he seemed pretty open-minded to the phenomena being real, especially after kind of empirical inquiry. And then in 1952, something very bizarre happened, which is there were a bunch of spottings, of UFO spottings around Washington, D.C. in July 1952. And then there's a Caltech physicist named H.P. Robertson who forms kind of a panel. And the conclusion of the panel is basically the government needs to systematically downplay the importance of the phenomena. And if the public were to know the truth, it would touch off mass hysteria. Every single head of Blue Book from that point forward, from 52 to 69 when it ended, became progressively more kind of anti-UFO. And so the question is this, typical CIA leaked doc to lead us off the trail, and is it bullshit? Or was manufactured stigma created between 1952 and 1969? Actually, Blue Book maybe initially was kind of open to.
What happened in 1952?
The DC UFO sightings in July.
Yeah, well, I was going to say
Well, what else?
The first H-bomb.
The H-bomb, Teller, yeah.
The Teller-Ulam design.
Yeah.
So the concern that I have is that in 1952, we sent off a signal, just the way when North Korea detonates a nuclear device, it sends seismic waves through the earth. It can't stop sending information outside of the country. I think in 1952, we sent a signal to the cosmos, which is that we're very, very close to being in possession of root level knowledge, to take a software metaphor. We are about to become root, which is terrifying if you're a system administrator, that you've got a hacker that's about to get full control of the system.
It's like your edge.org question, which was what happens when we discover our own source code?
Does something unprecedented happen?
Does something unprecedented happen?
When man finally...
Aliens.
Well, people didn't understand what the question was. That it was the final edge question. And instead of giving an answer, he asked us to give a question. The concern that I have is that in 1952, what if there was someone there to hear what we said in the Pacific? If there was something or someone there to hear us, they probably heard us as saying, we're on the verge of being able to come visit you. That's terrifying.
The Stargate program, which you ran, which is a government sort of psychic spy program, ran from 1972 to 1995, and it ended in 1995 under Ed May. And, you know, a lot of people after that said that it wasn't all that effective.
See, that's part of the negative
the stigmatization. Well, I was just reading Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, you know, where it talks about ATIP and I guess
OSAP, yeah.
OSAP, these two programs. And it looks like remote viewing is sort of, again, revived.
I don't think it ever really died.
So the question is, yeah, is that creating a stigma because you're bundling in parapsychology, which might be pseudoscience, with the UFO stuff, or is there some connection between those two things? Because there seems like a lot of overlap in terms of the people interested in the parapsychology stuff and the people interested in the UFO stuff.
As Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis put out a very nice paper of 6 levels of UAP phenomena, which range all the way from nuts and bolts at the bottom to spiritual or metaphysical aspects at the top and everything kind of in between.
Can you break that down for us? So, like, what are the 6 levels, and how are the nuts and bolts at all tethered to spiritual phenomena?
Well, see, they're the nuts and bolts things, but then some of the consequences of the nuts and bolts things are changes in what we call ordinary reality, which people who are the effect of might claim that that's some kind of paranormal thing, because that's the only word they can come up with to describe it. So there are paranormal things, and then it's sort of a gradation from there into things that are purely non-physical, but supposedly, quote, possibly psychokinesis.
I have to admit, I have such a strong, visceral negative reaction. It's very interesting because, as Jesse will tell you, Jesse was interested in this UFO, UAP stuff, and I couldn't be in the room with it. I hated the topic. It always felt like garbage to me. And I found out that I was apparently wrong about that. The federal government is certainly tracking this. It doesn't make any sense to me still that we have all these sensors and we don't have great video all over the place. I don't know how these UAPs, could possibly evade all of the cameras that we have outside of the government, and that we have no conclusive proof. But assume, okay, I was wrong about that at some level because we are now discussing this in the open. So I'm willing to start to revise everything that is protected by my desire to throw up. Right? There's just,
that just shows the stigma program's been very effective.
Well, it was on me, right? I'm being honest and open.
Yeah.
I still carry the sense of I cannot believe I am sitting here discussing visitations from some intelligent life that we don't understand potentially. But okay, so a scientist should be able to consider these things, and I'm not going to be the prisoner of the stigma. But I am going to ask.
You got A.V. Loeb at Harvard setting up his thing to pursue it.
But no, this is a really important question. If you could set up a ton of sensors, how would we know what we're seeing at high sample size if right now we don't know what we're seeing at low sample size? And I think one question I'd have for you, where I'd challenge you, is is there some physics that we will figure out in the future around certain people's ability to see these things? And that sounds really pseudoscience-y and crazy, but most of the people involved in the programs seem to think that there's something around that.
And as far as why aren't we getting really clear pictures? I mean, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the case, that we're not getting clear pictures.
You may be getting really clear pictures.
But the average guy with an iPhone, let's say the craft is there, but it's manipulating the space-time metric. So you're just going to get fuzzy outlines because light is being bent in various ways around the craft and so on. So you're going to get a lousy picture It doesn't mean because it isn't really there.
I would imagine I would be drowning in high quality video, and it's a great puzzle to me that I'm sitting here discussing this. I can't even solve this puzzle. And then the related puzzle having to do with remote viewing or anything like that is, if I take a materialist perspective that the world is created of material whose laws can be understood, and you put me in, and you, or say, in two lead-lined rooms, and we try to make sure that there's no way that any of the known forces or matter fields can communicate, my mind goes to, are we claiming that neutrinos are carrying the information? Are we claiming that there's a new force? Are we claiming that the world isn't material?
Or the entanglement is more
this is
spread out than involving.
Well, entanglement would be one of those things like Bohm Aronoff and Casimir, which has the appearance of being spooky, right? In other words, if you had a culture in which magicians possessed scientific knowledge, they would have an edge over everyone else because they could predict the Bohm Aronoff effect. See, I can manipulate this electron beam without even having any possibility of touching it, right? So this gets to the issue of advanced science being indistinguishable from magic. And then the idea that this is, in some sense, held by particular silos over other silos. I mean, as a scientist, I either want to laugh or my blood boils.
Well, I mean, that's kind of a justifiable position. For example, early on in the CIA remote viewing program that I set up at SRI, I was asked to check out claims of a psychic, Ingo Swann. Ingo had done experiments at City College in New York under Professor Gertrude Schmeider. She had set up thermistors, and from across the room, he could make the temperatures go up and down. And so I took this claimed psychic, invite him out to SRI to see what he could do. We had the quark detector, and so it was basically a quantum chip inside of mu metal magnetic shielding, inside of steel dewar for electrical shielding, inside of superconducting shielding, the requirement being that nothing could affect this thing from the outside. So I want to see if you can affect it. He affected it unequivocally 100%. You had this slow oscillation. What he did was he stopped the oscillation. Now what turned out to be even more, quote, magical was when we asked him, how'd you know what to do? And he said, well, all I did was look inside, and then he drew out how things were related inside that had never been published, and it turned out that they were accurate. And so it was when I wrote all that up and circulated around, that's when the CIA came knocking at my doorstep. And they said, oh, we've been looking for you. And I said, why? What'd I do? He said, well, the Russians have been spending millions of dollars at their best institutes with their best people for years. No scientist in America even believes there's such a thing as psychokinesis or ESP or whatever. And you happen to do this experiment. And so, we graduated from there to having remote viewing of super secret facilities and project titles hidden in safes. That's how the whole program got started. It ended up being a 20-year, $20 million program.
I don't know what to make of all of this. I don't think any of this, to me, sounds real. Now, that said, you could imagine a one-time backwards upgrade saying, we happen to know about aliens for a long period. We've kept it secret. We've figured out the physics. The physics has different fields. We're actually able to use this. We call it psychic phenomenon, so we don't have to give our secrets away. You could imagine a complete reworking of reality. Without that real working of reality, I would say this is BS.
What would be your best guess, assuming you think, because you have levered a lot of your life into parapsychology and you've levered a lot of your life into physics, how would you reconcile physics with parapsychology, which I realize is a $64 million question, but what would be your best guess? Do you have any theories?
Well, we can definitely rule out that it's EM brainwaves, because we put some of our remote viewers on submarines and took them to the bottom of the ocean, and we got some of our best results. In fact, the remote viewers in the submarine said, boy, it's really quiet here, you know, so.
Yeah.
I mean, if I think about it in terms of telescopy, right? For every long-range field, we now have a telescope. So we have optical and radio telescopes for photons. We have neutrino telescopes, which is actually matter rather than force. We know that neutrinos can zip through a planet and not even notice it was there. And then we have gravitational telescopes in the form of LIGO. And the weak force is going to be super short range, super weak, because it's effectively massive.
And we have vector scalar forces and EM.
Sorry, when I think about E&M, I'm thinking...
You're including vector and scalar potentials?
Hell yes. I mean,
okay.
Nobody,
okay.
Everybody's moved on to vector. I don't even want to call it vector and scale, just potentials.
Yeah, they're different.
Connections on fiber bundles. And then you have this issue of gravitation with LIGO.
Right.
Right, so we can pick up super long range stuff from colliding black holes by now measuring gravity waves. Gluons aren't going to do much for you. Quarks aren't going to do much for you. These are the fields that really give us information from distant galaxies. And then there's the question of, are you talking about a material world that we don't yet know?
Or material effects that is part of the material where we do know.
Where somehow we haven't
For
understood
example,
that there's a
entanglement. I mean, you have all these...
But you know the usual issues about it not being useful to communicate information. You have this bizarre non-locality of entanglement, but you can't use it for FTL, for faster than light communication.
Right.
Right. So if two events are space-like separated, you're not. So far as we know, there's no means of tricking an entangled
There's no means
ensemble.
of controlling it. Right.
Yeah. So this
but
is,
it happens.
Well, I'm struggling with this, to be honest, to put it mildly. And I don't like losing to Jesse. It's horrible losing him on UFOs. I don't want to lose it to him a second time. But I guess what the question is really, you don't have a lot of room to move. You either have to postulate new physics, you have to say that there are new effects like Aronoff-Bohm that we didn't understand, or in the physics that we already know, but we haven't unpacked them yet. Or you have to say this isn't material, that there are angels and demons and spirits that don't conform to our understanding. Everything here is bold. There's nothing that's simply, yeah, we saw this effect, it was robust.
So for me, I've looked into the Stargate stuff, and I've talked to you a decent amount. My conclusion is that there is something there, and yet it feels like there are a lot of near misses as well, and it seems very hard to instrumentalize and scale up.
There was plenty of times when we produced really good data, and to be fair, there were plenty of times when it failed.
If you don't understand the causal mechanism, then you're going to have repeatability issues. And so is there like a part of the brain, like the Penrose thing, which is probably wrong, but you know, this idea that he wrote in The Emperor's New Mind, that the microtubules, I guess that was the follow-up of The Emperor's New Mind with Hameroff, the microtubules are a quantum sensor that collapses the wave function into an eigenstate.
Yeah, I have some sympathy for going along that direction.
So you think there's some sort of quantum sensor in the brain, and do you have a top candidate for the specific structure?
Well, I can't rule it out. I mean, they certainly started from a very fundamental thing, and that is, if you can get rid of consciousness by using an anesthetic, then however you're doing it must have something to do with consciousness.
If this effect exists, why is it classified, and why is the government, where is it in the stock market?
Well, there are remote viewers who use it on the stock market.
So like the good example is that you guys tried to start a hedge fund, you know, just trading silver futures, and you made something like 260K, and I think scaling it beyond that seemed to be a big challenge.
It was only a challenge because I didn't have the time to do it. I mean, our particular thing.
I want to be polite, but I also want to be aggressive.
Sure.
My experience with money tells me that you can win over any skeptic very quickly if you can just shove millions of dollars into their pocket by arbitraging their skepticism.
Okay, well, let me tell you how to do it, and you just go do it. It's really easy, actually.
I know some people with capital.
Okay. Just have somebody pick a couple of objects, have them label them, mark it up, mark it down. and they're going to show you the object the following day, depending on what the market does. And then you do your best to generate a description. Then based on that description, they can go bet. And the next day, on the average, you get your money. We ran 70-30 instead of 50-50. And so it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward.
That's how we astounding claim.
That's how we got this $260,000, which is.
And why did you stop?
Well, the reason I stopped was I was already working, frankly, 24 hours a day on training the Army intelligence officers. And so I was exhausted after 30 days of doing this.
Sorry.
But if you want to do it, feel free to do it. I've told you how to do it, so you can just go do it.
Okay. Now, I'm having a very surreal experience. For a large portion of the conversation, you seem absolutely cogent, coherent, well-informed, well-spoken. And then there's this part that just doesn't make any effing sense. And this is the part that doesn't make any effing sense. Rolling up in a Bugatti to your Gulfstream to fly to your island is a very powerful argument that you know what you're talking about. The Bitcoin community has been insulted by the economists. They've been laughed at by financiers. And they have a phrase which I really detest, but I think you need to hear it. And it's called number go up. And number go up means that when you're talking to an esteemed professor of economics or finance, and they're telling you that you're an idiot, and you say, well, why don't you visit me at the Yellowstone Club? I'll send the jet around for you. Number go up is an incredibly powerful argument because of human greed and avarice.
Okay, I think we made this point. What do you think about, when we hear that they're unidentified aerial phenomena? That's one thing. But then when somebody like Bob Lazar comes out and says that he worked at a place called S4, which is a part of Area 51, on alien reproduction vehicles, literally reverse engineering crashed UFOs, what are we supposed to make of things like that?
Well, I mean, I'm skeptical. To the degree behind the scenes, we can check on his clearances and so on. I have reason to be skeptical, so I can't absolutely rule things out because everything can be manipulated.
Sure.